It's wonderful to see so many friends here, and I would like to start by remembering our colleagues in Gaza who, of course, cannot be with us due to the Israeli, Egyptian, American, EU blockade. If I've left anyone out, I'm sure others will remind them. And Palestinian, yes. Recently, kind of a blue ribbon panel, among them led by Brent Scrowcroft. Of course, you'll remember he was the national security advisor to the first President Bush, sent a report to President Obama entitled "Last Chance for the Two-State Solution." It warned, and I quote, that the next 6 to 12 months may well represent the last chance for a fair, viable, and lasting solution. But in fact, the two-state solution they call for in their report would be anything but fair, viable, or lasting. What they recommend is typical of peace process industry thinking about what a solution should look like. It is representative of such formulas as the Abu Mazen-Balin understandings, the Clinton parameters, the roadmap, the Geneva Initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative, among others. They recommend that the U.S. actually pressure Israelis and Palestinians to accept the following, and now I quote from their report. First, two states based on the lines of June 4th, 1967, with minor reciprocal and agreed-upon modifications as expressed in a one-to-one land swap to take into account areas heavily populated by Israelis in the West Bank. Two, a solution to the refugee problem consistent with the two-state solution that does not entail a general right of return, addresses the Palestinian refugees' sense of injustice, and provides them with meaningful financial compensation as well as resettlement assistance. Three, Jerusalem as home to both capitals with Jewish neighborhoods, settlements, falling under Israeli sovereignty, and Arab neighborhoods under Palestinian sovereignty with special arrangements for the old city. Four, a non-militarized Palestinian state together with security mechanisms that address Israeli concerns while respecting Palestinian sovereignty, and a US-led multinational force to ensure a peaceful transitional security period. This coalition peacekeeping structure under UN mandate would feature American leadership of a NATO force supplemented by, and remember this is the Palestinian state, Jordanians, Egyptians, and Israelis. A Palestinian state occupied by Israelis. And it continues. For anyone who cares about justice, this is a nightmare scenario. The so-called Palestinian state that would emerge would be nothing more than a NATO-occupied, gang-run dependency, much like the so-called independent Kosovo, which emerged a year or so ago. Now, contrary to conventional views, these parameters do not express a broad-based consensus on how to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They represent only the consensus within Western power elites and among some Arab liberals about how to produce ambiguous formulas that legitimize Israeli land grabs and colonization, negate refugee rights, and conceal deep disagreements. These formulas are totally incompatible with a long-established body of international law and UN resolutions which protect fundamental Palestinian rights. But if, as we are constantly informed, this solution is so obvious and desirable and enjoys so much support, we ought to wonder why it has proven impossible to implement. Time and again, the consensus collapses the moment anyone tries to define in detail what such formulas would mean in practice. Support for the two-state solution, even if this is unstated, derives first and foremost from a commitment to preserving Israel as a state where Jews enjoy political, civil, economic, military, and cultural supremacy. To guarantee Jewish supremacy, Palestinians must be contained by iron walls and an iron ceiling. The two-state solution, as typically expressed, is nothing more than a last-ditch plan to save Zionism as a practice of racial supremacy, but to try to dress it up as legitimate and consensual. I don't want to suggest that everyone who advocates a two-state solution is participating in some sort of conspiracy. Some people have a genuine belief that it represents the most pragmatic path to peace. A major attraction of it is that it appears to require only the formal ratification of a partition that already happened and that resulted in an already existing reality of two distinct geographical political entities. One of these is the Jewish state of Israel, and the other a Palestinian state in waiting, whose statehood merely awaits declaration. This fiction of an already achieved but somehow suspended partition has been constantly reinforced in post-Oslo discourse through, among other means, the abandonment by Western-backed Palestinian elites of the language of national resistance and liberation in favor of state building, capacity building, institution building, and all that kind of Western-funded nonsense. Despite the fact, and they engage in this discourse, despite the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are living under a military tyranny that is unparalleled in the modern world. We also witnessed the rhetorical transformation. Notice this happened only in 2006, after the elections, from a Palestinian Authority into a Palestinian government, and now into two Palestinian governments. The Palestinians with no state have more governments per capita than any other people in the world. At the same time, the Palestinian people were gradually downsized to exclude the diaspora and the refugees, Palestinians within Israel, and anyone else whose existence complicated the notion of a clean partition. Now they've even stripped Gaza of its membership in the Palestinian people. Those who supported and benefited from Oslo answered dissenters with appeals to pragmatism and realism, despite the reality that their own assertions that a Palestinian state was in the process of being built were little more than fantasy. Massive international donor funding was targeted at the West Bank and Gaza Strip to demobilize and NGOize, if that's a verb, Palestinian political movements who still used the language of rights, and to recruit their leaders to the Oslo project. All this was bolstered by insistent assertions from those involved in the peace process that the contours of a political solution were already virtually agreed along the lines I just spoke about, and all that was needed was sufficient political will to implement them. The failure ever to arrive at the stated destination of two states living side by side in peace could always be explained by some outside factors. Some favorites are the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the election of Benjamin Netanyahu the first time, the idiosyncrasies and even the unwelcome longevity of Yasser Arafat, who had to be assassinated to get him out of the way, the corruption of Ehud Olmert, extremists on both sides, and so on. You can come up with your own list of excuses. These convenient explanations meant that proponents of partition never had to re-examine their fundamental assumptions, and that they could continue to claim that other than a few issues that would not divide pragmatists, the dirty work of partition had already been done.